By the late 17th century, England's colonial trade was generating enormous wealth. English ships carried tobacco from Virginia, sugar from Barbados, and spices from Asia. But Scotland was legally excluded from this system. England's Navigation Acts of 1651, 1660, and 1663 required all colonial trade to flow through English ports on English ships. Scotland, despite sharing a king with England since the Union of the Crowns in 1603, was classified as a foreign nation for trade purposes. Scottish merchants who tried to break into colonial markets were treated as interlopers. Scotland remained one of the poorest countries in Western Europe, heavily dependent on agriculture, while English merchants grew wealthy from transatlantic commerce. In June 1695, the Scottish Parliament passed an act establishing the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies, giving it sweeping powers to establish colonies, sign treaties, and conduct trade. The scheme's chief visionary was William Paterson, a Scottish-born merchant who had helped found the Bank of England just 1 year earlier in 1694. Paterson had a specific location in mind: the Darien coast of the Isthmus of Panama, the narrow land bridge between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. His argument was that whoever controlled that choke point could charge the world for the fastest trade route between Europe and Asia. It was a strategically coherent idea built on dangerously thin intelligence about what conditions on the ground actually looked like. The company initially planned to raise $600,000 in capital split between Scottish and English investors. English merchants subscribed enthusiastically. Then the English East India Company, which held a monopoly on English-Asian trade, lobbied Parliament and King William directly against the scheme. The English Parliament threatened to impeach any English official who had supported it. English investors, under direct political and legal pressure, withdrew their subscriptions. Dutch investors, who had also expressed interest, pulled out under English diplomatic pressure. Scotland was left as the sole investor. Scottish nobles, merchants, lawyers, and ordinary citizens stepped in to fill the gap, subscribing approximately $400,000 to the company, a sum that historians broadly describe as representing somewhere between a quarter and half of Scotland's available investment capital, though the precise proportion is debated. Paterson's plan for Darien imagined a free port at the narrowest point of the Americas, a hub where goods from Asia and Europe would flow without tariffs, enriching Scottish merchants and funding the company's growth. He envisioned a harbor on each coast connected by a road across the isthmus, a concept that anticipated the Panama Canal by 2 centuries. What the planners lacked was reliable intelligence. The Darien coast was dense jungle, riddled with mosquitoes and malarial wetlands. The Spanish Empire had claimed the region for nearly 2 centuries and maintained a military presence in the surrounding territory. There was no established local trading population with demand for Scottish exports. The reports that reached Edinburgh were far more optimistic than the reality awaiting the colonists. On July 12, 1698, 5 ships carrying approximately 1,200 colonists sailed from Leith Harbor near Edinburgh. The colonists included merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, and ministers. The cargo included trade goods intended for local populations: wool cloth, felt hats, Bibles, and combs. The problem became obvious within weeks of arrival. The region had no significant population with money to buy Scottish exports. The jungle climate was lethal to people from northern Scotland. They named their settlement New Edinburgh and their territory New Caledonia, but the romantic names could not change the physical reality. After arriving in November 1698, colonists began dying of tropical fevers and dysentery at a rate that alarmed the survivors almost immediately. As the colony struggled, the colonists looked to nearby English settlements for supplies and emergency trade. The response they received was extraordinary. King William III of Scotland, who was simultaneously King William III of England, issued orders to all English colonial governors in the Americas explicitly forbidding them from providing any aid, shelter, or trade to the Scottish colonists. This was not an accident or an oversight. William was dependent on the English Parliament for financial and political support during his ongoing wars against France. When English commercial interests demanded he suppress the Scottish venture, he chose those interests over his Scottish subjects. Scottish ships seeking emergency supplies were turned away from English colonies in the Caribbean. By early 1699, the colony was in catastrophic condition. Fever and dysentery killed several colonists per day. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. Spanish diplomatic communications made clear that military action was possible. The remaining colonists voted in June 1699 to abandon New Edinburgh. The evacuation was chaotic and deadly. Of the original 1,200 who had sailed, only a fraction survived to leave, and many of those died at sea or in Caribbean ports where English colonial governors were still under instructions not to shelter them. The timing made an already bad situation worse. A second expedition had already departed Scotland before reliable news of the first colony's collapse had reached Edinburgh. Scotland sent a second group of roughly 1,300 additional colonists in a series of departures during 1699. They sailed without knowing what awaited them. When they arrived at Darien in late 1699, they found New Edinburgh deserted and decaying. Despite the obvious warning signs, the leaders of the second expedition decided to stay and attempt to rebuild. The same lethal conditions immediately reasserted themselves: disease, inadequate food, and now an active Spanish military threat. Spain had concluded it could not tolerate a foreign colony inside what it considered its sovereign territory. A Spanish naval and land force moved to besiege Fort St. Andrew, the colony's modest defensive structure, in early 1700. The Scottish garrison at Fort St. Andrew held out for several weeks against the Spanish siege. On April 11, 1700, the surviving colonists surrendered on terms that allowed them to leave with their weapons and personal belongings. Spain had decisively ended Scotland's colonial ambition. The two expeditions together had involved roughly 2,500 people. Historians estimate that approximately 2,000 died across both expeditions, the large majority from tropical disease rather than combat, though precise records from the period are incomplete. The 5 years of planning, the two expeditions, and the entire subscribed capital of the Company of Scotland had produced nothing but a deserted settlement on a jungle coast that the Spanish quickly erased. The losses fell across Scotland's entire investing class. Nobles who had put family fortunes into the company were ruined. Merchants who had subscribed found their capital gone. Some subscribers had borrowed to invest, meaning losses rippled outward through creditor relationships across the country. The company never paid a dividend. Scotland's government finances were separately strained by a severe series of harvest failures in the late 1690s, sometimes called the 7 ill years, which had independently killed a significant share of Scotland's population. The Darien losses landed on a country already financially fragile. Scotland's ability to conduct independent foreign policy, maintain armies, or manage a functioning national economy without English cooperation was severely undermined. Between 1700 and 1706, the question of Scotland's political future became entangled with its financial situation. England and Scotland began negotiations toward full political union. Debates in Scotland were intense and sometimes violent. Crowds attacked commissioners seen as surrendering the nation. But the financial arithmetic was hard to escape. Scotland needed access to English colonial markets to rebuild its economy. England, facing a dynastic succession question, wanted to prevent Scotland from choosing a different monarch. Historians debate the relative weight of financial need, political calculation, and direct payments to individual Scottish commissioners in producing the final vote for union, and the causal role of Darien specifically versus other long-running pressures is contested. What is clear is that the disaster fundamentally altered Scotland's negotiating position. A central financial term of the Acts of Union 1707 was a payment from England to Scotland called the equivalent, totaling €398,085 and 10 shillings. The money served overlapping purposes. It offset Scotland's share of English national debt that Scotland was now assuming as part of the merged kingdom. It partially compensated shareholders of the Company of Scotland for their losses, and it settled existing Scottish public creditors. For company shareholders, compensation arrived at a fraction of their original subscription and only after delays. Critics at the time, and historians since, have described the equivalent as England purchasing Scotland's Parliament. Whether that framing fully captures the dynamics is disputed, but it is accurate that Scotland's independent parliament was dissolved 7 years after Darien, in a context those losses had directly shaped. The Darien scheme is a 300-year-old case study in concentration risk, the danger of placing too large a share of available capital into a single speculative venture with poor information. Scotland's investing class did not diversify. They went nearly all in on one geopolitical bet while relying on an ally, King William, who had competing interests and chose those over his Scottish subjects. This scheme also illustrates how political risk, decisions made by governments for reasons unrelated to your investment, can overwhelm even a theoretically sound idea. Paterson's concept of a Panama trade route was not wrong in principle. The Panama Canal demonstrated that 2 centuries later. But sound theory without honest ground-level intelligence, political protection, and adequate capital reserves has consistently led to loss across every era. Every generation encounters its version of an obvious, can't-miss opportunity. The question Darien asks is whether you have stress-tested the assumptions behind it before committing.